James Graham, the first Marquess of Montrose, the Hannibal of the Highlands, was born into a time when Britain was in a precarious state. Scotland and England had recently been united under one king, James I of England and VI of Scotland. It was now his son, Charles I, who ruled the two, although there were many differences between these kingdoms, one of them being in religion. Now in England they followed an Episcopalian system, which was that the monarch elected bishops and they would obviously elect the clergy under them. The congregation didn't get a say. However, in Scotland, the majority of the population was Presbyterian, the opposite of the Episcopalian system, where the congregation voted on their ministers and there were no bishops involved as a political entity. However, Charles wanted to impose this on Scotland, an Episcopalian system of course, giving the monarch much more control over the church. Now the nobles in Scotland, who were largely Presbyterian, were against this move, and they got together and signed what became known as the National Covenant, which was essentially a large document in opposition to this Episcopalian system being imposed on Scotland and bishops being elected by the king to rule over the diocese of Scotland. However, the king wanted to impose this with force, so in 1639 he started to levy musters for a large army that would march north. However, the Scots did the same, and this obviously being the army in support of the Covenant became known as the Covenanter army. Some in Scotland did support the Episcopalian reforms of Charles I and formed a Royalist faction, which Montrose encountered at the Battle of the Brig of Dee, where he led the Presbyterians and the Covenanters to a minor victory over these opponents there. This was actually done after the signing of the Treaty of Berwick on the 19th of June 1639, which really ended what became known as the First Bishops' War, the title being because of course the Scots Covenanters didn't want there to be bishops in Scotland. This forced, obviously, King Charles down to the talking table, to the negotiation table, and really it goes to show that the Marquess of Montrose, what he wanted was a distinction between church and state. He didn't want the state, so the king, getting involved in church matters, and he wanted the church to stick to spiritual and religious matters, because of course bishops, while their function should be to honour the church and to deal with spiritual matters, in reality the bishops were given a lot of political power. Of course, the king was the one who chose the bishops, so he could give bishoprics and dioceses important positions in the church to his lackeys, to his friends, to ensure political hegemony, whereas the Scots were against this. They wanted a separation, and this was what the Marquess of Montrose wanted. However, there were also others like Archibald Campbell, who was the Marquess of Argyll, who wanted more power for the church and didn't want the king being involved, him being one of the ardent leaders of the Covenanters, but this put him directly against the point of view of the Marquess of Montrose, and this would become important later on in the video as well. However, he would actually lead the troops, however much he was against the hegemony of the Presbyterians becoming too powerful in Scotland. The Marquess of Montrose in 1640, when the English marched north again, did actually lead his troops south, the Covenanter army, and forded the Tyne at a place called Newburn, because on the other side was an English army, and he led a stunning victory of the Scots Covenanters over this English army at the Battle of Newburn in the Tyne Valley in Northumberland in 1640, which brought the Second Bishops' War to an end and was a resounding success for the Covenanters. However, afterwards he was taken to the Committee of Estates after being charged by Archibald Campbell, the Marquess of Argyll, and he was actually imprisoned in Edinburgh Castle. However, he was later freed because after the Second Bishops' War, Charles conceded to the demands of the Covenanters and released all those who had fought against him. Now, of course, this was just the start of a long period of conflict, and soon after, the English would find themselves embroiled in the English Civil War. Now, this would also continue on into Scotland. Of course, it was between Parliament and the King within England, but in Scotland it was between the Covenanters largely, who were aligned to the Scottish Parliament, who were in turn aligned, especially after the League of the Solomon Covenant, with the English Parliament, against those who supported the king, so the Royalists within Scotland. There was a separate civil war going on that was in many ways linked to the English Civil War. And oftentimes it was the Covenanters who were aligned to the Scottish Parliament who supported the Parliamentarian cause, whereas the Royalists were largely from the Highlands. Lots of them were Catholic, and they supported King Charles and the King rather than the Presbyterians, who were aligned to what was called the Kirk, which was the Scottish Church, which was reformed. So the Catholics had nothing to do with that, and they were often the supporters, or not exclusively, but often they were the supporters of the king against these. Now, of course, the Campbells were a very large political entity and very important at this time, Archibald Campbell being really the leader of the Presbyterian movement, or one of the factions within the Scottish Parliament, and this was a reform clan, so a Protestant clan. However, many of the clans, as I mentioned, were Catholic, so their traditional enemies, and the Campbells had many enemies at this point, like the MacDonalds, for example, were prime recruiting targets for the Royalists who often fought against them. Now, Marquess of Montrose was also supported by a man named Alasdair MacCulloch, who was a man from one of the Isles of Scotland, a MacDonald, and he was actually coming over from Ireland, which had sort of seceded at this point. It's a bit murky, I'll make another video about that in the future, from England with all the troubles going on, and he brought 2,000 of these Irish Confederate troops with him, very well disciplined soldiers to help the Marquess of Montrose in his campaigns in the Highlands. And the first campaign that he would go on would be at a place called Tippermuir, where he won a stunning victory over the Scots Covenanter forces. The battle began with the Scots Covenanter cavalry charging forward into what they thought would be an easy target, i.e. the Irish skirmishers of the Irish Confederate troops, but surprisingly the skirmishers were made of tougher stuff than they had imagined, and they were able to beat back the Scots Covenanter cavalry. Now after this, and the Covenanter army obviously being slightly confused that the cavalry had beaten back, Alasdair MacCulloch led his Irishmen into a charge into a larger but also very much untrained group of Covenanter militia, which he soon hacked through, and they started to run from the battlefield. Now at this crucial point, when the Covenanter army seemed to be losing the fight, the left wing of the army tried to get engaged. However, the Marquess of Montrose spotted this, and he had his Athol men and led personally the charge of his Highlanders into this Covenanter force and cut through them, winning the day and killing many of the Covenanter forces. Now in many of the battles that followed, he would be outnumbered and often would be fighting against rather experienced Covenanter forces, but he won great victories against them nonetheless. Now later on that month, he also won a battle at Aberdeen in September of 1645, this being against many cavalry charges of the Covenanters, which were broken resoundingly by the Highlanders and the various Irish formations that he employed. Now this brought the attention of course, Archibald Campbell, the Marquess of Argyll, and he soon started to lead his own force of Covenanters into the Highlands to track him down, as well as sending others to block off the exits from the Highlands, the passes, to try and block the Marquess of Montrose and trap him. However, the Marquess of Montrose decided with his troops to retreat from Argyll through the lands of Argyll, so marching through the areas of the Campbells, raiding as they went and pillaging the food supplies for the winter which would be coming on, which was a rather tactically savvy move. Now, at one point he did actually become trapped between the army of William Bailey, who was another Covenanter, and between the army of Archibald Campbell, so he needed to find a way to escape from this. Now what he actually did, and the reason why I've called him the Hannibal of the Highlands, is that he made a march across some of the toughest terrain in the Highlands. Now he actually marched across and onto Ben Nevis, which is the biggest mountain I believe in Great Britain, certainly in Scotland. And he really did this through some of the worst terrain that you can imagine in the Highlands. And the amazing speed at which he did this, of course, many of his troops being from the Highlands, so they were used to going through tough terrain and marching fast over mountains and bogs and glens and things like this. He managed to cover 36 miles through the mountains in 36 hours, which really is an incredible feat, and this completely caught his opponents by surprise and would lay the foundation for his amazing victory at the next battle at Inverlochy. Believing that the main force was still some 20 miles to the north after their amazing march, the enemies arrayed against them thought that this was just a small reconnaissance troop rather than the full extent of the army which they encountered during the engagement. Now they set up actually on the left wing with their clan castle, Inverlochy Castle, which they had musketeers standing on the walls to protect. In the centre they had the Marquess of Argyll's own troop, the Campbells, and on the wings they had several of the militia. In contrast to this, actually, the Marquess of Montrose set up in a very thin formation to avoid being outflanked, just 2 ranks deep, with the Irish regiments of Alasdair MacCulloch and O'Cahann's regiment on the two wings, as well as then in the centre his main troop of Highlanders. Now the battle started just after first light with a charge on the flanks of the two Irish regiments, who soon and in their violent and disciplined way managed to push back the levies, exposing the Covenanter centre, which the Marquess of Montrose exploited by having a Highland charge right into the middle of them. Now, after a while, some of these levies tried to escape into the castle, but then Marquess of Montrose sent the Royalist cavalry, being led by Thomas Ogilvy, round the back and started to cut them down. Now, many of the troops started to retreat at this stage, being surrounded by cavalry from the rear, the Irishmen on the flanks, and the Highlanders in the centre. And a last stand was made by the Campbells, but when their leader, Sir Duncan Campbell of Achaidh, was cut down with a musket ball and dying soon afterwards from the wounds in his thighs, the rest of the men started to rout, and many of them were cut down in the loch and by the Irishmen and the Highlanders who pursued them. Now, the Marquess of Montrose, after this amazing victory, was able to escape from the trap set by the Covenanter forces and marched back into Aberdeenshire, winning a great victory at Aldern, which I describe in my video on the Hofstra Cromlail, which actually describes that battle, as well as again at Alford. Although perhaps his most famous victory and most amazing victory against his enemies was at a place called Killeth near Glasgow. Now this battle was fought rather accidentally. It was by a much larger force. He was commanding around 3,000 men and 500 cavalry, whereas the Covenanters arrayed against him were commanding some 7,000 men and 800 cavalry, were led by William Bailey, who was himself a rather good general fighting for the Covenanters. However, as was often the case with the Covenanters, the church members played a large part, and they insisted that he engage the enemy rather than refusing to do battle with the Marquess of Montrose and earning a better position. So while he was being forced to redeploy his troops, spontaneous conflict broke out between some of the regiments arrayed against him, these being the MacLeans, who were occupying these cottages and firing their muskets at the Covenanters. Now, as things often happened, many of these troops just rushed in against the others without being commanded to do so, so there were small outbreaks of fighting between the two units at various points in the battle. But the Marquess of Montrose soon took advantage of this and sent his cavalry and his other Highlanders to engage in strategic points in the line as the Covenanter column was moving into the new position. And soon afterwards, many of the Covenanters were starting to be cut down by the Highlanders, who once again had manoeuvred into a better position than their opponents, with the Marquess of Montrose and Alasdair MacCulloch managing things from the front. And actually, from this Covenanter force of around 7,800 men, only 1/4 of them actually managed to escape from the battle. The other 3/4, 75% of them, were cut down during this fight at the Battle of Killeth. Now at this point, the remaining Covenanter leaders in Scotland actually fled south of the border because so many of their armies had now been defeated by the Marquess of Montrose, and tens of thousands of them lay dead at his hands. Now, he should then have been the master of Scotland, and he found himself unopposed in Scotland, and he called a council in Glasgow, and the first thing he did was to knight Alasdair MacCulloch, the loyal Scotsman leading the Irishmen, who had won so many battles for him, and then called a parliament and summoned King Charles. However, there was bad news south of the border, as Charles had just been defeated in the decisive victory of the Parliamentarians at the Battle of Naseby, which really made him doubt whether the cause was going to be won and was really a turning point in the English Civil War. Now at this stage, of course, he had to move south. The Marquess of Montrose had to go and support Charles, because if Charles was defeated, then there was no point in having a victory in Scotland. It had to be a victory throughout the three kingdoms of England, Ireland and Scotland, otherwise he wouldn't get the result that he wanted, which was Charles on the throne with limited power. So the Scots Covenanters, actually the best general was a man named David Leslie, who had been fighting in northern England against Royalist forces there, so they sent him north of the border to attack. However, when he came upon Montrose, Montrose had actually been abandoned by most of his men, because Montrose now wanted to march south into England to support Charles, but many of his men, of course, were Highlanders, and they were happy to fight in the Highlands, where if their women and children were attacked at some point, they could go back home and defend them and protect them. But at this stage, what he was asking them to do was to march into England, which would leave the Campbells, who were their sworn enemies, alone in Scotland to do as they wished with their clans, as well as having an open rear from which the Campbells could attack. And actually, when David Leslie's much larger force encountered Montrose, he had only around 500 followers and was easily defeated at the Battle of Philiphaugh, although he managed to escape. Now, he would actually return because he escaped and then fled to Norway in 1645. Now, obviously, in the meantime, Charles was executed by the Parliamentarians in 1649, but he would return in 1650 from Norway to avenge the death of the king with Danish and German mercenaries, although when he tried to rally the clans, there was no real support for him at all, and he couldn't raise as many men as he had done in his successful campaign of 1645. Now, he was actually ambushed and surprised by Highlanders, as well as obviously the Covenanter forces, at a battle called the Battle of Carbisdale. And following this battle, although he was able to escape, he pledged his protection to a man of the MacLeod family. And although Neil MacLeod promised not to deliver him to the enemies, they even fought together at one point at various sieges, he actually betrayed the Earl of Montrose, the Marquess of Montrose, and sold him to Archibald Campbell, obviously his great enemy, the Marquess of Argyll. And he had him sent to Edinburgh, back to the prison he had been in many years before. And he was then sentenced on the 20th of May to hang, and was killed the next day for his support of the Royalists, although after the Restoration in 1660 he was actually reinterred. His body had obviously been cut up and sent to various cities as a traitor. He was actually reinterred, and his heart, funnily enough, was put into a small casket made from the metal of his sword, which his family kept for a long time until it was lost during the confusion of the French Revolution, which was a fun little bit of knowledge there. So, thank you very much for watching. This has been my video on the Marquess of Montrose, the Hannibal of the Highlands, and his amazing victories during the War of the Three Kingdoms. Now, I have actually got another video coming out about David Leslie, who was the man who defeated him at one point, and is also another very interesting character from this period, Scottish character, who is similar in many ways, although actually fought for the Covenanters rather than for the Royalists, as the Marquess of Montrose did for most of his life. So thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to check out any other videos I mentioned if you're interested in this kind of thing. If you're new, remember to hit the subscribe button and tap the notification bell to stay updated, and give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. So thank you very much for watching. I've been History with Hilbert, and I hope you all have a cracking day.